William Topaz McGonagall was a Scottish weaver, doggerel poet and actor. He won notoriety as an extremely bad poet who exhibited no recognition of or concern for his peers' opinions of his work. He wrote about 200 poems, including the Tay Bridge Disaster and the Famous Tay Whale, which are widely regarded as some of the worst in English literature. Groups throughout Scotland engaged him to make recitations from his work, and contemporary descriptions of these performances indicate that many listeners were appreciating McGonagall's skill as a comic music hall character. Collections of his verse remain popular, with several volumes available today. McGonagall has been acclaimed as the worst poet in British history. The chief criticisms are that he is deaf to poetic metaphor and unable to scan correctly. McGonagall's fame stems from the humorous effects these shortcomings generate in his work. The inappropriate rhythms, weak vocabulary, and ill-advised imagery combine to make his work amongst the most unintentionally amusing dramatic poetry in the English language. His work is in a long tradition of narrative ballads and verse written and published about great events and tragedies, and widely circulated among the local population as handbills. In an age before radio and television, their voice was one way of communicating important news to an avid public. Early life. William McGonagall's parents, Charles and Margaret, were Irish. Throughout his adult life he claimed to have been born in Edinburgh, giving his year of birth variously as 1825 or 1830, but his entry in the 1841 census gives his place of birth, like his parents, as Ireland. It has been suggested that McGonagall may have falsified his place of birth, as a native-born Scotsman would be better treated under the poor law of 1845 than one born in Ireland. Career. McGonagall moved north and was apprenticed as a handloom weaver in Dundee, following in his father's footsteps. In 1846, he married John King. They had 5 sons and 2 daughters. Despite the Industrial Revolution slowly making weavers obsolete, McGonagall appeared to prosper, as there was still need for skilled workers to perform tasks of great complexity. Before he showed an interest in poetry, he displayed a keenness for acting, though Mr. Giles' Theatre, where he performed, let him play the title role in Macbeth only if he paid for the privilege. The theatre was filled with his friends and fellow workers, anxious to see what they expected to be an amusing disaster. The play should have ended with Macbeth's death, but McGonagall believed the actor playing Macduff was trying to upstage him and refused to die. By the 1870s, McGonagall and his family were struggling. Work as a weaver was more difficult to find, and his oldest daughter shamed the family by giving birth to an illegitimate child. However, an event changed him. He would write, "The most startling incident in my life was the time I discovered myself to be a poet, which was in the year 1877. Vi McGonagall claimed he was inspired to become a poet when he seemed to feel a strange kind of feeling stealing over, and remained so for about 5 minutes. A flame, as Lord Byron said, seemed to kindle up entire frame, along with a strong desire to write poetry." He wrote his first poem, an address to the Rev. George Gilfillan, displaying the hallmarks that would characterize his work. Gilfillan, himself an untrained and poorly reviewed polemic Christian preacher who occasionally dabbled in poetry, commented admiringly, "Shakespeare never wrote anything like this." McGonagall realized if he were to succeed as a poet, he required a patron and wrote to Queen Victoria. He received a letter of rejection, written by a royal functionary, thanking him for his interest. McGonagall took this as praise for his work. During a trip to Dunfermline in 1879, he was mocked by the Chief Templar, who told him his poetry was very bad. McGonagall told the man that it was so very bad that Her Majesty had thanked for what had condemned. The letter gave McGonagall confidence in his poetic abilities, and he felt his reputation could be enhanced further if he were to give a live performance before the Queen. In July 1878, he walked from Dundee to Balmoral, a distance of about 60 miles over mountainous terrain and through a violent thunderstorm to perform for Queen Victoria. When he arrived, he announced himself as the Queen's poet. The guards informed him, "You're not the Queen's poet. Tennyson is the Queen's poet." McGonagall presented the letter but was refused entry and had to return home. Undeterred, his poetry writing continued, and he reported events to the newspapers, earning some minor recognition. Throughout his life, McGonagall campaigned against excessive drinking, appearing in pubs and bars to give edifying poems and speeches. These were popular, the people of Dundee possibly recognizing that McGonagall was so giftedly bad he backed unwittingly into genius. He met with the ire of the publicans, on one occasion being pelted with peas for reciting a poem about the evils of strong drink. In 1883 he celebrated the official opening of University College, Dundee with the poem "The Inauguration of University College Dundee," which opened with the stanza, "Good people of Dundee, your voices raise, and to Miss Baxter give great praise, rejoice and sing and dance with glee, because she has founded a college in bonny Dundee." McGonagall constantly struggled with money and earned money by selling his poems in the streets, or reciting them in halls, theatres and public houses. When he was in periods of financial insecurity, his friends supported him with donations. In 1880, he sailed to London to seek his fortune, and in 1887 to New York. In both instances, he returned unsuccessful. He found lucrative work performing his poetry at a local circus. He read his poems while the crowd was permitted to pelt him with eggs, flour, herrings, potatoes and stale bread. For this, he received 15 shillings a night. McGonagall seemed happy with this arrangement, but the events became so raucous that the city magistrates were forced to put a ban on them. McGonagall was outraged and wrote a poem in response entitled "Lines in Protest to the Dundee Magistrates, Fellow Citizens of Bonnie Dundee. Are ye aware how the magistrates have treated me? Nay, do not stare or make a fuss, when I tell ye they have boycotted me from appearing in Royal Circus, which in my opinion is a great shame, and a dishonor to the city's name." Throughout his life, McGonagall seemed oblivious to the general opinion of his poems, even when his audience were pelting him with eggs and vegetables. Author Norman Watson speculates in his biography of McGonagall that the poetaster may have been on the autism Asperger's spectrum. Christopher Hart, writing in the Sunday Times, says that this seems likely. In 1890, McGonagall was in dire straits financially. To help him, his friends funded the publication of a collection of his work, Poetic Gems. The proceeds provided McGonagall with enough money to live on for a time. By 1893, he was annoyed by his mistreatment in the streets and wrote an angry poem threatening to leave Dundee. One newspaper quipped that he'd probably stay for another year once he realized that Dundee rhymes with 1893. Though trying his hand at writing prose and endorsements for local businesses for a short time. In 1894, he and his wife were forced to move to Perth. Soon after, he received a letter purporting to be from representatives of King Tay Bridge of Burma. In it, he was informed that the king had knighted him as Topaz McGonagall, Grand Knight of the Holy Order of the White Elephant Burma. Despite the fact that this was a fairly transparent hoax, McGonagall would refer to himself as Sir William Topaz McGonagall, Knight of the White Elephant, Burma, in his advertising for the rest of his life. In 1895, McGonagall and his wife moved to Edinburgh. Here, McGonagall met with some success, becoming a cult figure. And was in great demand. It did not last long, and by 1900 he was once again destitute and now old and sickly, though he was now too frail to walk the streets selling his poems. Donations from friends, as ever, kept him afloat. He died penniless in 1902 and was buried in an unmarked grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard in Edinburgh. A grave slab installed to his memory in 1999 is inscribed, "William McGonagall, poet and tragedian, I am your gracious majesty, ever faithful to thee, William McGonagall, the poor poet that lives in Dundee." Quote. Additionally, a plaque above 5 South College Street in Edinburgh shows an image of McGonagall, and bears the inscription, "William McGonagall, poet and tragedian, died here the 29th of September 1902. Tay Bridge Disaster." The Tay Bridge Disaster has been widely reproduced, and recounts the events of the evening of the 28th of December 1879, when, during a severe gale, the Tay Rail Bridge near Dundee collapsed as a train was passing over it. It began, "Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay. Alas, I am very sorry to say that 90 lives have been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time." Unfinished, I must now conclude my lay by telling the world fearlessly, without the least dismay, that your central girders would not have given way. At least many sensible men do say, had they been supported on each side with buttresses. At least many sensible men confess, for the stronger we our houses to build, the less chance we have of being killed. McGonagall had previously written a poem in praise of the Tay Bridge, the railway bridge of the Silvery Tay. "With your numerous arches and pillars in so grand array." Once the new replacement bridge had been built, he composed an ode to the new construction, an address to the new Tay Bridge, strong enough all windy storms to defy. In popular culture, in comedy, the memory of McGonagall was resurrected by comedian Spike Milligan. A character called McGonagall frequently appears in The Goon Show, alternately played by Milligan and Peter Sellers. Milligan also occasionally gave readings of McGonagall's verse. An episode of Monty Python's Flying Circus featured a McGonagall-esque poet called Ewan McTeagle, whose poems were actually prose requests for money. In Literature and Publications, a collection of 35 broadsheet poems of McGonagall, the majority signed by him, was bought for £6,600 from Leon and Amp Turnbull, Edinburgh auctioneers, on the 16th of May 2008. Satirical magazine Private Eye has printed a number of McGonagall-esque poems concerning great events of the day, usually under the byline William Rhys McGonagall, a portmanteau of McGonagall's name and that of William Rees-Mogg. For example, in 2007, they covered the success of the Scottish National Party in the Scottish Parliament election. McGonagall was the subject of the newspaper column Ripley's Believe It or Not, on the 11th of October 2007, saying he was often considered the world's worst poet, even by his own publisher, yet his writings are still in print a century after his death. Milligan further recounted McGonagall's life story in the pastiche novel William McGonagall, The Truth at Last, co-written with Jack Hobbs. In The We Free Men by Terry Pratchett, the NAC MacFeagle have a battle poet, Orgonagle, who repels the enemy through the awfulness of his poetry. Training up a successor, the old bard congratulates the young one. "That lad," he said proudly, "was some of the worst poetry I have heard for a long time. It was offensive to the ear and a torture to the soul. A very commendable effort." We'll make a McGonagall out o' you yet. A touching tribute to the memory of William McGonagall, famously excruciating Scottish poet. In the Harry Potter books, author J.K. Rowling chose the surname of the Professor of Transfiguration, Minerva McGonagall, because she had heard of McGonagall and loved the surname. The life of the bard and Costophine Round Table's particular affection for the poet is celebrated in a comic graphic novel by one of its former members, Charles Naismith. In live performances, Billy Connolly visited Dundee and the Tay Bridge during his 1994 World Tour of Scotland, where he talked about McGonagall and recited a passage from his book Poetic Gems. In motion pictures, a 1974 movie called The Great McGonagall starred Spike Milligan as a fictionalized William McGonagall. Peter Sellers played Queen Victoria in episode 13 of season 2 of Canadian TV series Murdoch Mysteries. One of the murder victims is holding a copy of a book entitled The Collected Works of William Topaz McGonagall. In music, McGonagall's poem The Famous Tay Whale was set to music by Matthew Cyber for the second Hoffnung Music Festival in 1958. The arrangement calls for a narrator, full orchestra, a foghorn, and an espresso machine. In Radio Dundee and actor Brian Cox compared the comic character Bob Servant to McGonagall while playing Servant in a radio adaptation. Servant is the creation of Dundonian author Neil Forsyth, who has acknowledged McGonagall as an influence in the Bob Servant character. Cox went on to play the part of William McGonagall in the radio play Topaz, a fictional depiction of his trip to Balmoral, which was broadcast on BBC Radio 4 on the 26th of October 2013. Honours and memorials. McGonagall's home city of Dundee maintains several reminders of his life. The William Topaz McGonagall Appreciation Society held a McGonagall supper on board the frigate Unicorn on the 12th of June 1997, during which the courses were allegedly served in reverse order, starting with the coffee and ending with the starters. A short play was performed by local actors. Beginning in 2004, the Dundee Science Centre Education Outreach has hosted an annual charity McGonagall Gala dinner, in which guests eat the meal backwards from dessert to starter and hear the welcome address as they depart, combining traditional and unconventional entertainment with four-course dinner, complimentary wine and whiskey. There is a McGonagall Square in the West End of Dundee. A number of inscriptions of his poetry have been made, most notably along the side of the River Tay on the pavement of Riverside Drive in Dundee. This monument contains a deliberate spelling mistake. Dundee Central Library maintains a William McGonagall collection of his works. He is buried in an unmarked grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard, Edinburgh. From c. 1950 to 1995, memorial bench stood on the path immediately to the north side of the church, commemorating McGonagall and bearing the typically McGonagall-esque inscription, "Feeling tired and need a seat? Sit down here and rest your feet." Unfortunately, the bench fell into disrepair and was not replaced. It is not known what became of its small plaque.